All right, I'm pretty excited, A, that we got this thing working.
Hey!
And I like to follow up A with 2, that James is in town. James Howat is the founder, brewer, blender of Black Project. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Black Project before. Anybody? Show of hands.
8 people.
So all of you.
Now you have.
All right, fair enough. Next. He's already heard of it.
Now.
Oh, no way.
You saw that.
All right, we have a sign. We have James. We have Marco. You guys run with this. Sorry I was late. Roy held me. So here we go.
Roy held you?
Yeah, hard.
Hard, okay. All right, I'm really
How
excited about
close
this
is this
too.
have to be with Is that good?
Let me move this out of my
Is that
face
good?
see if I can see you. You can carry it if you want.
I don't know.
Do you feel better that way, or do you? Okay. All right. We're gonna talk about spontaneous beer today.
Cool.
Yeah. What's that? Well, I'm not gonna answer any of that. We're gonna have James answer it. But Black Project, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And as a brewery, your beers are all spontaneously fermented.
That's not 100% true.
Not 100% true.
I can talk about it.
Let's talk about it. I'm really intrigued by what you guys do. It's incredibly interesting. I'm sure everybody else is too. There's a ton of people standing here. But what is Black Project? How did it start, first of all? And then we'll get into how you guys are fermenting your beer.
So Black Project is a very small brewery in Denver, Colorado. We focus on 100% cool ship caught microbes, which means we make essentially all sour beers. We started this about a little over 3 years ago with we had actually a neighborhood brewery tap room called Former Future Brewing Company, which was, we made a porter, salted porter. We made a India Pale Lager. Lots of cool neighborhood beers. But from our very beginning, we were focused on at that project. It was about taking historic ideas and sort of doing them in a modern, innovative way. And to me, the purest expression from that, even before we opened, was the cool ship and spontaneous fermentation. And doing things that are similar to what's done in Belgium, but taking and doing experimentation with that style of inoculation that has not necessarily been done otherwise or elsewhere. And so we did a Kickstarter to get a cool ship, and people were not into that idea back in 2012. And we kind of scraped it together on our own. I bought our first barrels on a Monday after a good weekend, literally taking cash out of the register and heading down to our local barrel broker. Being in Denver, that's a thing, so that's kind of cool. So heading down there and getting 2 barrels and putting them in the back of my Subaru and driving them back and then filling them. And very early on, we started with so we're still small. We have a 4-barrel brew house, and we didn't get this Kickstarter for a cool ship, so we took these 2 huge stock pots. They're about 60 gallons apiece and about 30 inches tall. And we covered those with a mesh, put them on the roof, and used that as our cool ship in the wintertime. And we started that essentially immediately when we first opened the doors to our tap room. And our bartenders and a lot of people working for us didn't really even know what this was, didn't really even know we were doing it. It's typically, we're brewing during the day, our IPL and our other kind of beers. And we're doing these cool ship beers at night, as you do. And so people didn't really know what was going on. And then came time to enter beers for our first GABF, which was GABF 2014. And kind of out of nowhere, I was like, we can only afford to enter 1 beer. It actually costs money to enter beers into the competition. Not a lot of money, but at the time it was a lot of money. And so we were going to enter 1, and they were like, you should enter the porter. It's the most popular beer. And I was like, it's a salted porter. There's 0 categories for that beer. And quite frankly, it wasn't my favorite beer in the world. It was the customer's favorite beer. It was a great beer. But I was like, what about this single barrel of cool ship beer? We can enter it as a wild ale. I think we should do that. And everybody's like, what are you even talking about? Our bartender's like, what is a cool ship beer? And I'm like, well, we've been putting it on the roof. And this whole thing, I tell them the whole story. And they're like, well, what's been going on right now? And I was like, well, it's kind of been a secret. And so the name Black Project kind of comes from the fact that we started sort of scrappy, very much top secret, is a side venture, and that beer ended up winning a medal. And then from there we said, cool, we probably should do more of this. And we had actually been doing more and more as time went on. And just in this past August, we said, we're not going to do the neighborhood tap room anymore. We have enough capacity now. We're going to do 100% these beers in our tasting room and everything. No more IPA, no more IPL. We actually do an IPA with wild yeast, but none of those other beers. We're 100% Black Project now. So that's kind of the culmination backstory. Yeah.
Where are you at now? I know we've advanced a little bit from the stock pots, basically.
Yeah, so we did stock pots for the first, I guess really the first 3 seasons. And it sounds really small, but remember, 260-gallon stock pots, we're a 4-barrel brew house, so that's almost a full batch size for us to fill both of those. But this year we expanded, and part of the reason why we're able to take over the tasting room and do it full time is we expanded, put in about 150 oak barrels. Additional, we have 8 Solera vessels that are running. They're each 15 barrels apiece. And we got a 10-barrel copper cool ship, which we actually have a divider in. So if we need to, we can do a single batch. But for the most part, we double batch every brew and fill the whole thing. It's in our barrel room under a big, beautiful window, getting nice Denver inoculation. So
a lot of people here, and home brewers and pro brewers alike, are getting in more and more into cool ships, spontaneous fermentation. Was there any lessons learned from the original process of those stock pots that maybe, things that you should not do or things that you should do to create the best environment for that kind of fermentation?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's kind of an ongoing question. We sort of have 2 to 3 base beers now that we're putting through the cool ship. One of which has been released. It's the base beer for the Cygnus. It's called Oxcart when it's by itself. The other ones are still aging. Will be released later. But I've been experimenting a lot, and I continue to experiment. What does it look like if you have 60 IBUs? What does it look like if you have 6 IBUs? Traditional lambic is about 30 usually. So we start there, and then we vary. And I'm still sort of learning about this. I don't really have great advice about what to do to make it best, other than probably start with the Belgians do, and then if you want to experiment, take baby steps away from that, because what they do works, and then maybe take a little bit from that at a time. One thing, if you're a pro brewer or even a home brewer, to consider is blending's super important, and you're going to have a lot of waste, in my experience, and I think this is probably true in the Belgian experience also. We dump 10% of our beer that we put through the cool ship is not drinkable, is not blendable. And about another 10% is partially blendable, which means it adds complexity into a blend, but at least at our current scale, that whole barrel, most of it ends up going down the drain. So almost 20% of the beer we put through the cool ship gets put down the drain, which as a home brewer, you can probably imagine that sucks quite a bit. As a pro brewer, it also sucks quite a bit. That's a lot of dumping. If you're making IPAs or whatever, 20% is a ton. But that's the nature of the game, I think. So.
Yeah. Have you noticed any kind of characteristics or things that you've seen as a guidepost where this leads to a more successful attempt, or this leads to a more successful batch of beer? Is there any characteristics that you aim for when approaching these beers?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for us, we've experimented a lot with, like I said, hopping rates and pH adjustment, and I think we tend to aim now between 10 and 30 IBUs, usually about 15 IBUs so far, which is important. A lot of American sours now are made with 0 IBUs, essentially no hops in the boil. We're using aged hops, which a big thing we learned is just because if you're a home brewer, aged hops are 0% alpha acid, so you plug that into your Beersmith or your Brew Toad or your whatever the hell you call it now. You're like, oh, that's 0 IBUs. That's not true. Oxidized hop compounds also create bitterness and also the same antimicrobial properties. Beer's still going to be sour, but you probably want to have some antimicrobial action going on. You are just sitting this out, so you want the beer to taste like beer ultimately. And then I guess overnight temperature is a big thing, so we aim for 20 to 40 degrees as an overnight low. We're pushing that range a bit and just experimenting with it. But I'm committed to the fact that like that may all be dumped as we get outside that range. So we'll see. Maybe it's awesome, and we just need to start doing it when it's warmer or colder. But
sure, so
I'm
20
not
to
certain.
20 to 40 is a guidepost. But
Yeah, Fahrenheit. Yeah.
Sure. Let's for the purposes of talking about the two beers here, let's get into these. What we've got in front of us. The first one is Cygnus, which is what we're drinking. Maybe go into a little bit about the idea behind the beer and kind of maybe the process too. And I think Chris is pouring it right now if people want to try it.
Yeah. So Cygnus is our base beer, our base 1, 2, and 3 year, which is a 1, 2, and 3 season blend of Cool Ship beer. We've only been able to do this past fall. We bottled these beers. The base is called Oxcart. So some of this beer is some of the first stuff we brewed on the roof when there was no Black Project. There was no name to it. We hadn't entered anything in JBF. We were barely opening the tap room, and I was like, I don't even know what this is going to turn into. But we tried it because it was something I was really passionate about. So we made the blend, and then it's actually not super common, I don't think, even in Belgium, where you make a blend, and the blend that becomes your base beer that you release by itself is also the beer you fruit. But the way it worked out for us and the way our volume is, we're very small. This was actually our same base beer, which is a 3-year blend, a really complex blend. I think it's really great on its own. We ended up heavily fruiting that. This is between 3.5 and 4 pounds per gallon of blackberry. I think it works really well. It's got a huge fruit characteristic, but you let it warm and you really sit with it for a while, and you get really great complexity of the base beer. And I think that's what the Cool Ship lends us.
We asked a little bit about fruiting earlier, but 3 to 4 pounds per gallon. How do you determine? How do you go about determining how many pounds per gallon do you want to?
I mean, you can do small scale tests. I think with this we knew we wanted to go pretty high, but still leave a little bit of the base flavor. I mean, we actually make a beer called Shadow Factory, which is 4.5 plus pounds per gallon. We haven't bottled that yet. Maybe we will, but you can't taste the base beer basically at all. It's complex, mixed culture, Cool Ship caught fermentation of fruit, but the base beer itself, I'm not sure if it's there. That's probably not a rate we would do with a spontaneous beer like this, where we've taken 3-year-old beer. Is it really necessary to get that complexity if you're just going to put a ton of fruit in it? And this is sort of pushing that boundary. We did this for our members. We have a membership program, which I'm not authorized to talk about any more than that. But this is a member-only beer. And so we did Cygnus Blackberry, which is what this is. And this is actually, I think, the first time it's been poured publicly. We also did Cygnus Cherry, which is more in the lines of like more creaky style. It's a little lower, 2.5 pounds per gallon, and it's not more into tart cherry. And you can get a little more base beer in that.
I've read some stuff about some of the things you said about turbid mashes versus single infusion mashes for these kinds of beers. I guess if you can kind of give maybe your thoughts on, we're going to go to a Cool Ship, what kinds of mash process are we going to go through to get our best results? Or
Sure, yeah. So we spent basically 3 years researching that, and essentially almost every time I brewed this for the first 2 years, it was a different mash schedule and a different hopping rate, and almost everything was different. And my thought was, well, if nothing else, I'm creating different blending stock, and I can look and say, interesting, because remember, we were doing only 2 oak barrels at a time, and it was from 2 separate Cool Ship vessels. So we could influence each Cool Ship, so to speak, and that became 1 barrel. So we could experiment with a lot of stuff. And we started with a real traditional turbid mash, and we still do that on a lot of our beers. We did settle, in some cases, for 1 base on a very high infusion. So if you're a home brewer, you probably think like, well, I wouldn't make a beer that's saccharification temperature above 158 or so Fahrenheit, and we sometimes will mash in the base of this beer at 168, 165 to 170. And it's not a long time. It's a 15-minute saccharification at, say, 168 plus. What you end up with is a very starchy, very unfermentable wort, which is ultimately what happens with the turbid mash. So instead of removing wort pre-saccharification and then boiling that so it doesn't ever get converted, we make the whole thing not convert very well in the mash. different ways of doing it. And so, like I said, we do both depending on the base. That took a while to come across. I actually think that the way we do that is actually probably less fermentable, in other words, more starchy than a traditional turbid mash. In fact, when those spontaneous barrels start fermenting, the Croissant that comes off the barrels, when it dries, we just let them ferment out of the barrel. It floor drains in our barrel cellar. It just goes. And it dries, and the foam coming out of the barrel is almost like styrofoam. Like normally it would just go away. This sort of like stays there, and like you can poke it and it's crunchy. That's how starchy the word is. So it's pretty cool.
Like insulation.
Yeah, it's truly like a very, very undense styrofoam, which is weird, but it's also like interesting that in a year that's down to, in specific gravity, like 1.001 or like close to zero Plato. So the bugs we're getting are able to attenuate that, which is making this starchy like crust of a styrofoamy Croissant when it first starts fermenting. We fill the cool ship, and there's lots of bubbles, and they don't go down the next morning when we do that style mash. There's still foam on top of the cool ship, which is not normal with a turbid mash, but it's just very, very, very starchy. And I think it's interesting. That's part of what we want to do is research and development into spontaneous fermentation versus just following what the pioneers of it have done and what the traditionalists have done.
Sure. It seems like you guys are very you guys want to pay homage to the traditionalist mentality, but you're really not about kind of approaching your beer that way. You want to see what you can push the boundaries on and how far you can push the boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the advent of method goose, we've made definitely beers that fit that categorization, and we are going to make more that does that. So we make a base called Blackbird, which has never been released, which is about as traditional as you can possibly get. To a very, very strict standard, it's traditional. So that's part of it, but I also want to take what those guys are doing in Belgium and say, some of the reasons you're doing these things are not based in experimentation. They're based on tax laws 100 years ago. They're based on the cost of ingredients 100 years ago and things like that. Great, they make great beer. What if we don't do those things, but still cool ship and still do 100% spontaneous fermentation? So that to me is a really inspiring thing.
Yeah, we have a lot more.
For sure, yeah. It's just a very different thing, and I think that if lambic and spontaneous fermentation was preserved in a different part of the world, what we would be talking about right now would be a very different process. It's not that is the only or best way to do it. It is a great way to do it, and those beers are excellent. But what if we don't? What if we break some of those rules?
Sure.
So, yeah.
Cool. The other beer we're going to be pouring from the stage is, I can't read the label.
It's Dreamland. Yeah.
So let's talk about Dreamland for a little bit.
Sure. So Dreamland is, I said, not everything we do is 100% spontaneous. Dreamland's a good example of that. We have 8 Solera vessels. These are 15-barrel tanks that we never empty all the way. We literally got them, cleaned them out the first time, and then we started these beers with spontaneous barrels. So a barrel that was filled from the cool ship, had fermented and made beer. We took that barrel, put it in this vessel, and then put wort on top of it, let it develop, put wort on top of it, let it develop until the tank was full. And those are all cool ship caught microbes in this beer, but it isn't spontaneous because we had a finished product we were using as an inoculant. No lab, we don't use any lab bugs at all. Anything that says Black Project, you can be sure doesn't have any lab products in it. That's not what we do. But this is not spontaneous. We call it wild, whatever you want to call it. It's a cool ship Solera. So this beer averages about 10 months. Because it's a Solera, that means that we have, say, 16 barrels in this tank. We might take 4 barrels out and package it or blend it, and then we brew 4 barrels in to fill it up. So we try to keep it above 50% full at all times. So we're essentially just constantly feeding this vessel. And we have several that have this quote-unquote Dreamland base. They've changed and evolved. They're very different between each other. And so every time we make Dreamland, a lot of people are like, oh, you have 4 vessels of that. And I was like, well, every one is a blend. And so that's a lot of my job is trying to make Dreamland the same every time, which is not always possible. It depends on the attitude, so to speak, of each of these different vessels. And so that's how we do that beer. Yeah.
What an incredibly complex beer. If everybody have a chance to try this beer.
Yes. Yeah, Dreamland's really one of my favorites. It's not heavily fruited. It's the base for a lot of our heavily fruited beers. We do dry hop beers with this. We do a lot of different things with it. We fruit it and put it in barrels and all kinds of stuff. And to me, it's kind of my baby. I think ultimately the 100% spontaneous base is hopefully our flagship and that I'm most passionate about. But this is a very, very close second. I like fermentation forward beers, and I think this is really beautifully complex in fermentation, and it develops super well in the bottle if you lay it down. I mean, we tend to have a real peach apricot flavor. I mean, I've had aged bottles of this where people wanted to argue with me that I put peaches in it, and I'm like, I did not put peaches in it. And they're like, you put peaches in it. And I'm like, I promise you I didn't, sir. Like, I would charge more for it if I did. I didn't. It's hard to put fruit in beer like that, and like I didn't. But I'm glad it tastes peachy to you, you know. And that's a little bit of our Black Project character, and that's all coolship derived. And we actually find that in our coolship beer, you lay it down for a while. I just had a taste of it recently, and it had that same peach character coming through that didn't necessarily have right when we blended it. And I was like, nice, that's our house character. It's maybe more apricot than peach. I don't know if I can tell the difference in beer, but it's microbially derived, and it's becoming a little bit of a house character for us. So.
I mean, how much variation do you see from batch to batch, and do you embrace that? I mean, it seems like
Yeah, for sure. Each one is its own beer. I mean, it's not like, oh, I've had this batch of Dreamland or this bottle day of Dreamland, so I don't want to have another one. I know what it's like or whatever. To me, they're all different. It reflects my palate on the day we blend. It reflects where the totes are when we're blending it. And how they've developed over time, and so it's a big thing, and it's always going to be an evolving product. It's interesting now having the tasting room because we had to move away from the term batch because we used to just do bottle releases, and now we might pull a few kegs off, and that's a custom blend for that. So we've moved away from batch just to bottling date because not every time there might be something different on the tap than what we actually have in the bottle for the next time. So yeah,
amazing. We have time for questions from the crowd now, so if you guys have any question about these beers, all right, here we go.
First off, man, your beers are awesome.
Thank you.
I'm curious about the Solera you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You said, if I heard correctly, you pitch fresh wort on top?
That's right, yep.
So do you have true building up in the bottom? Do you have yeast cake growing? Is there any way that you deal with that? Do you want that? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a concern. We've never emptied these and emptied that out, but we've only been doing that for about 2 years. So at some point, there may be a true concern. I have a racking arm in those. Actually, I have some that don't have a racking arm, and they're about 8 inches up from the bottom of the tote. So it's not that high. That's all I know. And the other ones, I have a racking arm that goes up 12 inches. So if that starts pulling in true when I'm at the full vertical level on the racking arm, then we'll deal with that. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But I think, honestly, true wild Brett has a really good autolysis isn't necessarily as much of a thing. These also aren't huge tanks, so we're not getting pressure-derived autolysis. And Brett's going to take a lot of these compounds that would come from autolysis and convert them into fruity, great compounds on its own. So we do definitely get weirdness as it goes along, and I'm not sure if that's from micro breakdown or not. But we also aren't pitching a ton of cells, so it's always a slow, pretty low cell count. I call it like a feeding. We add wort. It's not like we have a huge mass of cells like you would in a regular ale or lager fermentation. So, yeah. Yeah, thanks.
So, 2 quick questions.
Okay.
How do you
Only
keep
one.
How do you keep your beard so tight?
Uh-huh.
And what's an agent? It's 2 quick questions. Where are the agents? The agents.
They
hands
know
up.
better than to raise their hands. They know better than to raise their hands. Even if they have a shirt on that says it, they can't raise their hands. I see them out there, but I don't even really know what the first question means. Kegels. I make the beer do kegels. Nice and tight. I regret saying that already. But I'm just going to go ahead and assume what you're talking about. So, we'll start over. Maybe just next question. Yeah.
Move on.
Yep.
Don't trust that guy.
Don't trust that guy on the stage with a microphone.
Hey, James. Great beers. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, how do you? So you obviously bottle condition these beers.
Yeah, everything's bottle conditioned. Yeah.
So, you have a tap room.
Mm-hmm.
How do you have these beers feel and taste the same coming out of a bottle as you do coming out of a keg? What is your technique in order to do that?
So we're working on it.
Thank you, Chris, for bringing James here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Sorry I said kegels on stage. I just said it again. You should have us start earlier, so I've been drinking for 6 hours. Anyway, no, to answer your question, we're working on getting more and more kegs to be keg conditioned. So essentially the same idea where instead of being re-fermented in the bottle, it's just re-fermented in the keg, and the bartenders know you got to pour the lees off before you start it, and don't move the keg after you've tapped it. So we're doing increasing amounts of that. We have some beers also that we don't bottle that we put on tap, and so some of those are just forced carbonated because it's just how it is. We're always really tight on production, and I start to get a little bit of flack when it's like, oh, you only have 4 beers on tap, and the bartender's like, what's going on? I'm like, well, you know. So I mean, we're trying to work up to that and like having everything be keg conditioned. Right now, pretty much if something's in a bottle, it would be keg conditioned because of how we do things. But we have some beers. So for example, we have a wild isolate yeast strain that we use to make an IPA. That's just forced carbonated. It's a like New England style IPA with a really fruity wild Saccharomyces strain that we isolated in my neighborhood, and that's just forced carbonated. So yeah,
Yeah, I just brew my IPAs with yeast I foraged in my neighborhood.
it's no big deal.
Any other questions?
Of course, right? So I understand Chris's put this to your mouth thing. That's what Chris was doing. Okay, so I have 2 questions. Do you know if your altitude has anything to do with like what your beer tastes like?
I don't think it does.
You don't think it does? Have you?
No, I mean I've never. We've never brewed outside of. We have brewed other places in collaborations, but it's been different style of beer and stuff. So, probably the only thing is carbonation is. You have a little bit less gushing issue at sea level, but it's very, very minuscule difference. So, I don't think there's necessarily a thing. Yeah.
And you said you have a sack strain for like IPAs and stuff?
Yeah, it's a wild caught sack strain. So we have 2 wild Saccharomyces strains that I harvested from a crabapple tree across the street from my house. Back when I was a home brewer, one of them we've used pretty extensively, and then the other strain was just literally in a test tube for many years, 2 years, 3 years. And I was like, hey, we should grow this up and see if we can do something with it. A black project. It is wild yeast, truly wild yeast, and I was growing up a 5-gallon starter of it, which just seems like a large starter, but it's not really that large for us. And I was like, man, it smells a lot like white wine. It's like really, really fruity. And the big key for me was it wasn't really phenol positive. So that funky Belgian sort of characteristic that you get from a lot of wild yeast strains, almost all of them have a gene called POF, which stands for phenol off flavor. And that means they make phenolic compounds. Most strains you would use to make an IPA do not have that. And this one, to me, does not have any phenolic character. It identifies under microscope and on media as a Saccharomyces strain. I've never had it genetically tested or anything, but yeah, so it's really fruity. Works really great for a super dry hopped hazy IPA.
So if you know one of your agents, perhaps.
What's that?
What's an agent? So your bottles are bottle conditioned. You don't use any like bottle it with bottling yeast.
We had a very small period for like 3 months where we did that, but we don't anymore. Yeah.
Kale. I'll need your bottle when you're done, Kale.
All right.
I think that's it. Thank you very much, James.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, thanks, guys.
This picture should make sense.